Hello, Rune Scholar, wherever and whenever you are. I'm the modern Erilar. In our last episode, I mentioned that runic inscriptions in Orkney showed some influence from Iceland. So, today, let's talk about Icelandic runes. Runes appear frequently in Icelandic sagas and poems, like Egil Saga and Grettis Saga, but there have been relatively few runic archaeological finds from Iceland, and those that we do have are often 13th century or later. It has been quite difficult to account for this disconnect between what the sagas and the material culture tell us, but we can indeed tell that settlers used runes on everyday objects from early in the settlement period, well into the 18th century and later. Many of the earliest were recovered in the 2008 to 2010 excavation of the new Alþingi building site in Reykjavik, and very few of these newest finds have been written about in English as of the middle of 2024. One of the best known early fragments is from the island Viðey, north of Reykjavik, found in 1993 in a monastic archaeological context where the layers were quite disturbed, which makes dating according to how it was found in the archaeological sequence quite difficult. The runes themselves are of 11th century forms, so this is probably the most reasonable way to date the find. The fragmentary nature of this stick makes interpretation difficult, except for this very last word, which means love. Another fragment was excavated in 2009, and maybe even older. This is an 11-centimeter rune stick of yew wood, dating from the earliest occupation layers of the Alþingi site, from the late 9th or early 10th centuries. Yew is not a native tree to Iceland, so this carving had to have been imported with some of the settlers. The carving is indistinct, but may read U-R-N, and then continue past this broken edge as the beginning of a longer inscription. The R rune here may be new to us in that the lower portion of the twig is straight rather than obliquely angled. This rune does also appear in some 10th century Norwegian runic inscriptions, and the Norwegian younger Futhark logically forms the foundation on which the later Icelandic Futhark was modeled. There are very few inscriptions on wood from this earliest period in Iceland, so this in particular is an important artifact. We then have a sandstone spindle whorl with a circular inscription, likely dated to the 11th century. The inscription contains the earliest name in Iceland that was carved with runes, Vilborg. A dotted U rune, likely representing a Y sound, appears later in the inscription and clearly shows an influence from either Denmark or Sweden rather than from Norway, where the Ir rune evolved to represent the Y sound during the 10th century. The other rune forms in the inscription resemble those from the early 10th century, but they could also easily date from the 11th. These runes have elongated staves and very short twigs, whereas over the course of the 11th century, the twigs elongate and the staves generally become shorter in proportion to the twigs. A rune stick with 3 smoothed sides also likely dates to the 11th century, based on its depth in the occupation layers as well as the forms of its runes. We can see that the first rune has kind of chipped off, but the remaining impression in the wood seems to indicate an R rune. This R is open in that the branch does not reconnect with the stave halfway down the rune. And in younger inscriptions, this type of R is more typical. This O rune with the twigs on the right is unusual, but there are some other examples of this occurring. In the N rune, the branch fully crosses the stave, and this type of N rarely occurs after the 11th century. For example, the N rune of this broken medieval spindle whorl has the later short twig on only the right side of the stave. This aligns with its date from sometime between two eruption layers from 1226 and 1500 of the Common Era, respectively. The inscription is an ownership message. Mike means owns me, but unfortunately only the last two runes of the woman's name survive. This then indicates that this last rune is the Knisol rune, which transliterates to a C. This is the oldest Icelandic example of the Knisol being used as a C rune for a K or a G sound, but in Norway this rune is in use by about 1200. We also have a partial Futhark on a runestick of a similar medieval date. The first couple runes are unintelligibly scribbly, but this third rune is likely to be one of those hoggle runes that I mentioned in the Orkney episode, with the extra long branches, even if we can't quite tell whether it looks precisely like this, or like this. The A rune here has a slightly curved twig, and the S is the full-size Icelandic type with the rhomboid, circle, or diamond-shaped lower end that is sometimes seen on gravestones from the 14th century. The Y rune here is a stung U, and the diacritical mark that differentiates the Y from the U is here a small diagonal line, and my rune font here just has lines that are vertical. The use of this rune form was rare in Norwegian and Danish inscriptions because ear stood for the Y sound again, but this stung U does appear as a Y after the 11th century. From the 14th century, we have a spindle whorl from Stormerk in Rangarvala, or Rangarvatla. It features a very Icelandic character for the Y, and two of what is generally referred to as a Greenlandic R. It was also used very sparsely in Norway, but it's much, much more common in Greenland than it is in either Norway or Iceland. We also see Greenlandic influence on a door from Valþjófsstaðir, which dates to around 1200, where stung U was used for an O sound. This usage appeared in Greenland as well, but there are no Norwegian examples using a stung U for an O. We also see a Thors rune variant that looks like a lowercase b, as well as this new A, E, short A kind of a vowel that is fully, where the stave is fully crossing, fully crossed by the branch. And we know that this rune developed during the 12th century because an inscribed piece of driftwood from the Alþingi site shows us an example of this rune, which represents the sound in the word gerti. We also start to see serious inroads from the Latin alphabet in the form of this bind rune, combining a Latin D with a runic R in the word drekka. So what can we say about an Icelandic Futhark? The 10th and 11th century Norwegian-based Icelandic Futhark had an order to which we have become accustomed. I have added runes here for G and E into the sequence, but if you recall the Stormerk spindle whorl from a couple slides ago, these are not usually included in the Futhark rune row as their own characters. I'm just including them here for ease of use. Between the 13th and the 17th centuries, the order of the runes in surviving rune rows shifted to reflect that of the Latin alphabet, and we have a new runic sequence in alphabetic order. The sea rune, as I mentioned, was relatively rare, but it appears in manuscripts from the 14th century and later. In using a dotted tir for a D or the sound that is medial or ending in a word, the Icelanders tended to prefer this second variant here, where the dot is on the main stave, versus this first version here, where the dot is between the angle of the stave and the twig, which is extremely rare in Iceland. This is in alignment with the Greenlanders' preference for the dot on the stave as well, but the Icelanders themselves also used a ring instead of a dot on the stave when they were writing stung runes. The second of the P runes here eventually completely superseded the dotted B variant in Iceland. And the Q rune that we have varies a lot. The version from Bergthorshvöllr was more squared off than purely diagonal, but my runic font doesn't have one that really reflects that particular variant. After the 13th century, I had already mentioned that Icelanders were using this rune to represent a Y, but after the 13th century, they start using this double-ended variant for their Y. Various runes were used for X and for Z, but they're so variable across the inscriptions that I didn't find it that useful to suggest a specific variant for these letters here. And again, these new iterations of the tors and this short A sound. So now that we have these Futharks, what did the Icelanders call these runes? For other Futharks, we have consulted the associated rune poem for that country, and we do have an Icelandic rune poem. The Icelandic rune poem is 13th century or later, and 4 versions survive today. The language of the texts may be as old as the 14th century and is certainly not later than the beginning of the 15th, though this first manuscript that I'm showing here from the Árni Magnæan collection in Reykjavik is from the early 16th century. A second manuscript, AM 461, dates to 1534 to 1558, and there are 2, possibly more, later copies in 17th century printed books. Each version contains a 16-stanza poem in poetic meter with alliteration and rhymes, and consists simply of 3 phrases or kennings that describe the meaning of the rune. This oldest version contains a further explanatory phrase for each stanza comprised of one Latin word that translates the rune name and then provides an Icelandic synonym for the word king that starts with the same letter as the rune name. These multilingual kennings show influences from medieval Icelandic literature and some knowledge of astrology and alchemy. And this leads scholars to believe they may reflect more of an educated elite than the everyday rune writer. Simpler names appear in the younger versions of the manuscripts, but Richard Page pointed out that these seem to be secondary to the poem. As you can see here, parts of this manuscript are almost impossible to read, so some scholars fill in the gaps from the Old English rune poem, while others choose to use Olafur Thordarsson's 3rd grammatical treatise to replace the illegible material. If you'd like a transcription of the Latin kennings, I suggest picking up a copy of Matthias Nordvik's translation, which is in its 1st edition as of 2024, and I'll describe that in the further reading section at the end. Here, I'll just describe the verses of the oldest manuscript. Wealth is a source of discord among kinsmen, and the punishment of falsehood, and the path of the grave fish, probably meaning a serpent. Shower or drizzle is the lamentation of the clouds and ruin of the hay harvest, and hated by the shepherd. Giant is the torture of women and a rock spirit and the husband of a giantess. God is aged Gauter and prince of Asgard and lord of Valhalla. Riding is the happiness of the seated one and a speedy journey and the toil of the steed. Ulcer is a disease fatal to children and disaster and the abode of mortification. Hail is cold grain and snowdrifts and sickness of serpents. A version with twigs that are almost as long as the stave itself is much more common in Iceland between the 15th through the 17th centuries. Constraint is the grief of the one in bondage and the state of oppression and toilsome work. Ice is the bark of rivers and the roof of the wave and the road of the doomed one. Plenty is the boon to people and good summer and thriving crops. Sun is the shield of the clouds and the shining ray and the destroyer of ice. In the oldest version, the L and the T are switched in the order, and this verse here is reconstructed because of those now illegible sections of text. Tyr is the god with one hand, and the remains of the wolf and the prince of temples. Birch is the blossoming twig and little tree and fresh young shrub. Human is the delight of man and the extension of the earth and adorner of ships. Water is the eddying stream and broad geyser and sandbank of the fish. Yew is the bent bow and brittle iron and giant of the arrow. You may be wondering why I haven't covered any of the Icelandic magical staves in this episode. If you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend the work of Albert Bjornschiel, the Sussex Pellar, and his recent book on the subject. I haven't covered staves in this episode because every grimoire in which these staves were recorded is post-medieval in date, and that would be getting ahead of ourselves, no? So let's cover some more medieval runic trends in our next episode. Thank you for reading the runes with me, the modern Erilar.